Solomon Reed had washed dishes at Maribel's on Freret Street for 19 years, $13.25 an hour. And the floor staff knew exactly two things about him. He never called in sick, and he never said much at all. Tucked in his apron was a brass harmonica, 60 years old. 2 words filed into the coverplate: "Ride it out." The man eating alone at table 11 that Friday sat on a hospitality fortune the papers put at 300 million, and he had no idea that the grudge he'd carried since he was 9 was about to surface from a dishwasher's pocket. Before the kitchen closed, that harmonica would either give Solomon back the voice a flood had taken from him, or prove that some silences a man keeps on purpose. Solomon woke at 5:40 most mornings out of a habit older than the alarm clock he no longer set. He rented the back half of a shotgun house on Josephine Street in Central City. 2 rooms and a kitchen of a hallway, $640 a month, which was a lot for the block and a little for the city, and exactly what was left of him after the rest of his life had been taken apart. He made coffee in a dented percolator and drank it standing at the window, looking at the same patch of cracked sidewalk and the same chain-link fence and the same magnolia 3 doors down that bloomed every May whether anybody watched it or not. He ate 2 eggs and a slice of cornbread from the pan he kept seasoned the way his grandmother had taught him, cast iron so black and smooth it shone like a river stone. On Mondays it was red beans, because it was always red beans on Mondays, because that was the day you cooked something that could take care of itself on the back of the stove while you worked. And Solomon kept the old days even when there was no one left to keep them for. He did not own a car. He had owned one once, a brown Buick that smelled like Renee's hand cream. But that was a long time ago, and the Buick had gone where so many cars went in the late summer of 2005, which was nowhere anyone ever found it. So he walked. It was 31 minutes from Josephine Street to the keep door of Maribel's if the lights cooperated. And he timed himself the way some men time a jog, not for speed but for the steadiness of it, the proof that his knees would carry him one more day. He walked past the corner store where Mr. Pham raised a hand without looking up, past the Amy Church with the marquee that had said, "Still and no since the spring," past the barber shop where the old men sat in the window arguing about a ball game that had ended 40 years ago. They knew him to nod at. None of them knew where he worked. None of them had heard his voice in long enough that they had stopped expecting it. There had been a time when Solomon Reed talked more than any man on the block. There had been a time when his voice was the whole point of him. He clocked in at 3:58. He always clocked in early. Maribel's was the kind of place that called itself a neighborhood institution in its own menu, which is the kind of thing places say when they are trying to be bought. White tablecloths over butcher paper, gumbo that was good, and shrimp remoulade that was better. A bar where the bourbon cost more than Solomon made in an hour. He hung his jacket on the 3rd hook from the left, the one that was his, and tied the apron, and went to the back where the world was steam and the clatter of plates and the long stainless trough that had been his country for 19 years. He liked it back there. Nobody back there needed anything from him but clean dishes, and clean dishes he could give. He had not always been a man who wanted so little. He had married Renee Boudreau in the summer of 1986 in a church that no longer stood, and for 19 years, the same 19 he would later spend at the trough, as though the universe kept its books in even columns. They had lived in a double 6 blocks from where Maribel's would one day open. Renee taught 3rd grade. Solomon did his own work in the evenings, the work he no longer named to anyone, and on Friday nights she would make a gumbo that took all day, and they would eat it at a kitchen table with the radio on, and no money to speak of, and more than enough of everything that counted. They never had children of their own. The doctors had a long word for it, and Renee had a short prayer about it, and somewhere in their 40s they had made the quiet peace 2 people make when they decide the love they have is the love they were given to spend. So they spent it on other people's children, dozens of them, hundreds over the years, and called that a family, and were not wrong. Then came the last week of August in 2005, and the levees, and the water that rose to the gutters and stayed for 3 weeks, and when it went down, it had taken the church and the double, and the Brown, Buick, and Renee, who had gone back for a neighbor's cat and a box of her mother's letters and had not come out. They found her on the 9th of September. Solomon did not go to identify her. A cousin did that. He sat on a cot in a shelter in Houston with a borrowed phone and a list of the dead, and a silence opened up inside him that he would not climb out of for 19 years. Somewhere in those weeks he made the only decision a drowning man can make, which was to stop trying to keep anything that could be taken. He came back to the city in 2007. He did not rebuild. He rented 2 rooms on Josephine Street, found the quietest work a talking man could find, and put his voice away like a suit he could no longer afford to wear. The arithmetic of his life after that was simple, and he ran it every 2 weeks the way he had once run scales. $13.25 an hour, 32 hours most weeks. Call it $410 after the government took its piece. Rent was $640 across the month. Light and water ran another $90. He spent maybe $60 on food because a man who cooks for himself and keeps a seasoned skillet does not need much. What was left, and there was always a little left because Solomon Reed had learned to need almost nothing. He did not save. Every payday he walked to the corner store and bought a second bag of groceries. Rice and beans, a Saskoff cornmeal. Whatever fruit looked tired enough to be cheap and good enough to eat. And on his way home he left it on the bottom step of the Blue Shotgun 2 doors down, where a young mother named Tasha was raising a boy and a girl on a home health aid's wages, and a faith Solomon recognized because it had once been his. He never knocked. He never let her see him. When she came out the next morning, the bag would just be there, the way the bread had just been there on June's step under the overpass. The way the right thing has of just being there, when somebody decides to put it there, and ask nothing back. That was how his grandmother had taught him to give, on a porch in Plaquemines Parish, before the family ever came up to the city, before any of them had 2 nickels, snapping beans into a chipped enamel bowl. "You don't do good so it'll be counted," she would say. "You do good so it'll be done." And the other one, the one he kept closer than the harmonica, the one about a child stuck on a hard letter. Red-faced and furious, the whole table waiting. You don't rush a man finding his words. You stand there till he finds them. She had been gone 40 years. He could still hear the snap of the beans. The harmonica had been his father's, and his father's fathers before that, brought up out of the country in a coat pocket, the way some families carry a Bible and some carry a deed. The Reeds carried a single battered instrument that had played in fields and front rooms and the back pews of churches for longer than anyone living could account for. Solomon had learned it at 6. By the time he was a young man he could play a hymn, so that grown women fanned themselves and wept, and he had played it every Sunday of his married life from the second row of a choir loft that no longer existed. He had used it in the evenings, too, for the work. Because he had figured out young, before he had the words for why, that the same breath that carries a note across a room can carry a word across the gap where a stutter lives. He had filed the 2 words into the cover plate himself, with a triangular needle file. The winter he turned 30. After a child he was teaching said them back to him as the only thing that ever made the fear go quiet. Write it out. He had meant it about the breathing. He had not yet known how much of a life a man would one day have to ride out on nothing, but the air still moving through him. He had not played in public since 2005. The harmonica rode in his apron every shift, warm against his chest, and he took it out only in the dead hour, only for one boy, only where no one could see. He told himself he kept it for the weight of it, the way you keep a watch that no longer runs. He knew, the way you know a thing you refuse to look at, straight on, that he kept it because it was the last instrument of a life in which his breath had been good for something. And a man does not throw away the last proof that he was once of use. What the floor staff did not know, because the floor staff never came back far enough to see, was that Solomon Reed watched everything. A dishwasher learns a restaurant from the back of its teeth. He knew which servers cried in the walk-in and which ones stole from the tip jar. He knew that Carlos the line cook sent a plate of whatever was family meal out the alley door every night to a man named June who slept under the Claiborne overpass, and Solomon knew it because Solomon was the one who had started doing it first, years back, wrapping cornbread and the heels of the bread in foil and leaving it on the step where June would find it, and he had never told a soul, and when Carlos took it up, Solomon let him think it was his own idea. That was the kind of giving Solomon believed in. The kind that did not need to be seen to be real. His grandmother had a phrase for it, the way she had a phrase for everything, sitting on the porch in Plaquemines Parish with snap beans in her lap before the family ever came up to the city. You don't do good so it'll be counted. You do good so it'll be done. She had another one too, the one he carried closer than the harmonica. She used to say it whenever one of the cousins lost patience with a child who couldn't get a word out, a child who jammed on a hard letter and went red trying to push it free. You don't rush a man finding his words, she'd say, and she said man even when she meant a 6-year-old, because to her every soul was a whole person already. You stand there till he finds them. Solomon had built a life on that sentence once. Then the water came and took the building, and the wife, and the work, and Solomon discovered that a man can lose so much that his own voice starts to feel like one more thing he can't afford to keep. The new boy had started in August. Elijah Carter, 18 years old, just out of Cohen High, hired to bus tables and run the food when the floor got slammed. He was tall and careful, and he wore his hair in short twists his mother kept neat for him, and he had a smile that came out slow because he was always doing math behind it, the math of a kid who has decided he is going to community college in the spring and is counting every $40 night toward the $2,100 he needs for the first semester. Solomon had clocked all of that in a week. He had also clocked the thing the floor manager wrote up as a problem in Azatha's second week, the thing the brokers would find so funny 2 months later. Elijah stuttered. It was not a small stutter. It was the real thing, the kind that has nothing to do with nerves and everything to do with the wiring a person is born into, the kind that roughly 1 person in 100 carries their whole life, and most people understand about as well as they understand the far side of the moon. When Elijah hit a block, he hit it hard. His jaw would set, his eyes would go down and to the left, and the word would stick behind his teeth like a stone in a pipe. And the longer it stuck, the worse it got, because the whole room would lean in to wait, and waiting was the cruelest thing you could do to him. And most rooms did it without even knowing they were doing it. The specials were the worst. Maribel's made the busboys recite the specials when they cleared, some idea the owner had about charm, and 3 nights out of 5, Elijah would stall on the B in barramundi, or the S in soft shell, and stand there drowning in front of a 4-top, while they smiled their tight, uncomfortable smiles. Solomon had heard it from the back the first time. He had set down a rack of glasses very slowly and stood still, listening, and something in his chest he had welded shut 19 years ago had pulled at one of its seams. He did not say anything to the boy, not at first. But he started doing small things. He took to carrying the heavy bus tubs himself, so Elijah wouldn't have to stack them while the table watched. When the specials board went up at 4, Solomon would find a reason to be near it, wiping a counter that didn't need wiping, and he would read the words out under his breath. Slow, easy, the way you'd hum a tune, and a few times Elijah caught him at it, and Solomon just kept wiping. One night in September, when Elijah came into the back nearly in tears after blocking on the word reservation in front of a man who'd laughed, Solomon handed him a glass of ice water and did not tell him to relax, because telling a person who stutters to relax is like telling a drowning man the water would be nicer if he weren't so wet. He just stood there. He stood there the way his grandmother taught him till the boy could breathe. Then he said the only sentence he'd said to Elijah in 3 weeks. "It ain't your fault, and it ain't your nerves. It's just how your wires run. We can work with wires." Elijah had looked at him. The word jammed. Solomon waited. "You know about it?" "I knew a man once," Solomon said, and that was all he said, and he picked up his rack of glasses and went back to the trough. That had been a month ago. Since then, in the dead hour between the lunch breakdown and the dinner rush, when the kitchen emptied out for a smoke or a nap in a parked car, Solomon and Elijah had a thing they did that nobody saw. Solomon would take the brass harmonica out of his apron and play 4 bars of something old and slow, an Amazing Grace or a Sometimes I Feel, like a motherless child, and he would tell the boy a thing that sounded like superstition and was actually the truest thing anybody had ever told him. "You ever stutter when you sing?" he asked the first time. Elijah said no, the way every person who stutters says no, because it's the one place the stone lifts off the pipe and nobody can explain it to them. "That's because singing rides the breath out," Solomon said. "The block comes when you slam the door on the air. You don't push the word. You float it out on the breath you already got going. Like a harp." He played a long bending note. "Hear how I don't bite down. I let it ride out. You start the hard word with the air already moving, soft, and you ride it out." He had Elijah hum the start of a sentence before he said it. Hum it like the harmonica, and let the words tumble out on the back of the hum. Easy onset. A speech therapist would have called it, if Elijah had ever been able to afford one. Solomon never used the term. He just called it riding it out. And he tapped the 2 filed down words on the harmonica cover, and Elijah, who had spent 18 years believing his own mouth was a thing that had been built wrong, started, for the first time, to believe it was a thing that could be played. Solomon did not tell anyone they did this. Not Carlos, not Miss Beverly, not the boy's mother when she came to pick him up. He had decided a long time ago that the back of the restaurant was where he kept the last of himself, and he kept it locked. And he opened it for one boy 4 nights a week for 15 minutes, because his grandmother's voice would not let him do otherwise. You stand there till he finds them. He did not know yet whose brother Elijah's stutter would remind a stranger of. He did not know that the gray-suited man who had started coming in alone, 3 Fridays running, ordering the gumbo and watching the floor and writing nothing down, was about to recognize a method he had not seen practiced in 50 years and had spent his whole life trying to forget. Damon Whitfield had come up 2 miles and a world away from Solomon Reed, in the Calliope projects, in a 3rd-floor unit where the elevator never worked, and his father worked the docks until the docks worked him to pieces. Damon was the older of 2 boys. He was the hard one. By the time he was 14, he was run numbers for a man on Earhart, and by the time he was 22, he had turned a bad business into a barely legal one. And by the time he was 30, he was clean and incorporated and so hungry it scared the men he borrowed from. He built it the way the truly poor build, with no margin for tenderness. Buying failing restaurants and gutting them and selling the bones, then buying better ones and keeping them, then buying the buildings the restaurants sat in, until he held a piece of half the hospitality square footage from the quarter to uptown, and the magazines called him a turnaround artist, and the city named him to a board or 2. He wore suits that did not look expensive, because he had learned that looking expensive was for men who were worried. And Damon Whitfield had decided at the age of 9 that he would never again be a man who had to worry. He had decided it the day his little brother got beaten behind the school. Isaiah was the soft one. Isaiah was 2 years younger and stuttered so badly that he barely spoke at all in public, and the boys on the block had smelled it the way boys smell weakness, and one afternoon 4 of them had backed Isaiah against the chain link and made him say a word, just say it. Come on, say it. And 9-year-old Damon had stood at the corner, with a bag of groceries in his arms, and not moved. He told himself for 50 years it was because there were 4 of them and he was small. He knew the truth was uglier. He had been ashamed of his own brother. He had stood at that corner and felt in the same second a fury at the boys and a hotter, sicker fury at Isaiah for being the kind of person things like this happened to. He set the groceries down. He walked over. He did not help his brother up. He told the boys to get lost in a voice that already had the docs in it, and they got lost, and then he hauled Isaiah up by the collar and hissed the sentence that would become the founding law of his entire life. The world eats the soft ones, so you better stop being soft. Their father, when he heard, agreed. Their father had a belt and a philosophy, and the two were not unrelated. A man who can't talk is a man who can't sell, he said, and a man who can't sell is dead weight, and there's enough dead weight in this family. He said it across the dinner table with Isaiah sitting right there going red. Damon had nodded. Damon had always nodded. It was the only safe thing to do. What Damon did not know, because he had left for the docks himself by then and stopped looking at his little brother as anything but a problem, was that something had reached Isaiah in the year he turned 11. A man at a churchmate clinic, free of charge, 2 evenings a week. A young teacher with a brass harmonica who told a roomful of stuttering children that their mouths were instruments nobody had taught them to play. Isaiah came home one winter able to order his own po' boy at the counter, slow but steady, writing the words out on his breath. And the father said, "Well, look who decided to join the conversation," in a tone that took the win and spat on it. And Damon, home that weekend, had felt that same complicated heat and had said nothing. He had not asked Isaiah where the new voice came from. He had not wanted to know. To know would have meant admitting his brother had needed saving and that someone other than a Whitfield had done it. So Damon filed it away as none of his business. And within a year he had moved out for good. And within 5 years the brothers spoke only at funerals. And within 50 years there was only one funeral left to speak at. Isaiah Whitfield died in April. He was 51. He had become a Sunday school teacher in Baton Rouge, a deacon, a man who married a kind woman and raised 2 daughters, and was beloved by a congregation that had never once thought of his speech as anything but the particular weather of a particular good man. Damon learned all of this at the repast, from strangers, from people who had known his brother better than he had, and he stood in a church hall in Baton Rouge in a suit that did not look expensive and shook hands and understood, far too late, that the soft one had built a life of love and the hard one had built a life of square footage, and only one of them had ever been rich. A woman from the choir told him, not knowing who she was telling, that Isaiah used to say he'd have stayed locked up inside himself forever if a man hadn't taught him to ride his words out on his breath, like a harmonica back when they were children. Damon had nodded. Damon had always nodded. But the sentence had gone into him like a hook, and it had been working its way deeper for 6 months, and on a Friday in October it was going to find bone. He had not come to Maribel's for the gumbo, though the gumbo was the best in the corridor he was about to acquire. His company had a letter of intent on the building and the business, and Damon had a rule he had kept for 30 years. Before he bought a place, he ate there 3 times alone, said nothing, and watched. He watched how the staff treated the table that didn't tip. He watched the ones nobody was watching. He had bought and killed enough restaurants to know that the books told you what a place earned, and only the floor told you what a place was. And Jimmy, who had spent his whole life unable to feel much of anything, had kept the one feeling that had made him money, which was the feeling for the soul of a room. So on 3 Fridays he sat at table 11, ordered the gumbo, declined the wine, and watched. And on the 3rd Friday, a foretop of out-of-town brokers his own acquisitions lawyer had brought in to celebrate the deal that wasn't quite closed, sat down at the big round in the center of the floor, and one of them, loud, 3 bourbons in, decided that the tall, careful busboy clearing their first course was the funniest thing he had seen all week. It started with the specials. The floor managers, a slick young man named Theo, who managed the way some men drive. Fast and only at the speed limit when they think they're watched, sent Elijah over to recite while he refilled water 2 tables away. The brokers wanted to hear the specials. The loud one insisted on it, waving off the printed card, leaning back with his arms crossed, because he had clocked the kid's hesitation when he came up and he wanted the show. "Go on," he said. "Tell us what's good." Elijah set down the bread plate. He took the breath the way Solomon had taught him. He tried to ride it out, and on a normal night with a normal table he might have made it, but there is no riding it out when 6 adults go silent and lean in, and a grown man smiles at you like you're a slot machine he's waiting to pay off. The B in barramundi locked. Elijah's jaw set. His eyes went down and to the left. The word stuck behind his teeth, and the table waited, and the longer it stuck the higher the loud one's eyebrows climbed, and then he did the thing. He mimicked it. He cocked his head and went buh, and looked around at his friends, and 2 of them laughed, the helpless ugly laugh of people who know they shouldn't, and the loud one said, "To the whole table, to the floor, to anybody." They got you running food and you can't even read it. The dining room did not go silent the way rooms do in stories. That was the worst part. It kept right on, forks and low conversation and someone's ringtone, the ordinary noise of an ordinary Friday, while a kid stood in the middle of it being taken apart. Theo, the manager, 2 tables away, looked over. Theo did the math the way Theo always did the math. The brokers were a $600 check, and a man from the buyer's office was somewhere in the room, and the busboy was a busboy. Theo looked back down at the water pitcher. Miss Beverly, who had carried plates at Maribel's for 31 years, and had buried 2 husbands, and did not as a rule give one good damn what a table thought of her, started across the floor with her jaw set, but she was at the far station, and the round was at the center, and she was 63, and the distance was the distance. Elijah did not run. That was the thing Solomon would think about later, the thing that undid him. The boy stood his ground in front of the table that was laughing at him, back straight, the way Solomon stood at the trough, the way his mother had taught him, the way poor people who have decided to keep their dignity stand when they cannot afford anything else. He could not get the word out, and he could not walk away, and so he just stood there and took it. 18 years old, $2,100 short of community college, holding a bread plate, while a man who would forget the whole thing by morning made the shape of his deepest wound into a joke. In the back, Solomon Reed had a rack of wine glasses half out of the machine, steam rising off them, and he had heard the bup come ringing back through the pass like a struck bell, and he had gone absolutely still. He stood perfectly still for 11 seconds, the glasses cooling in his hands, the old welded seam in his chest tearing all the way open at last. 19 years he had kept himself in the back. 19 years he had decided that the safest thing a man could do with what was left of him was nothing. His grandmother's voice came up out of somewhere below the floodline, clear as the day she'd set it on the porch with the snap beans in her lap. You don't rush a man finding his words. You stand there till he finds them. Solomon set the rack of glasses down on the steel. He untied nothing. He straightened nothing. He did not take off the apron. He just set down the towel that was over his shoulder, laid it flat on the trough's edge, the way you'd close a book you meant to come back to, and he walked out of the back of the restaurant and onto the floor for the first time in 19 years. The man at table 11, who had been about to signal for his check, set down his spoon and watched the old dishwasher come. What Solomon Reed and Damon Whitfield did not know, 3 rooms and a lifetime apart, was how close they had already been, how many times. Damon's company had owned the linen service that pressed the apron on Solomon's back. Damon had walked the loading dock of Maribel's twice during due diligence, 8 feet from the trough where Solomon worked, and had seen the way men like Damon see service workers. Nothing at all, a shape in steam, a function. Solomon had abused Damon's brother's first solid sentence out of a church basement half a century before either of them had ever heard the name Maribel's. The harmonica that rode in Solomon's apron was the same model dented the same way, that an 11-year-old Isaiah Whitfield had been allowed to hold at the end of every lesson, as a reward for getting through a paragraph. The harmonica Isaiah had described to a choir woman in Baton Rouge in the last year of his life, the harmonica whose two filed words a dying man had repeated like a prayer. Ride it out. It had sat in Solomon's pocket all night, 3 feet from the pass, while the man who would weep to hear it ate gumbo at table 11 and watched the room for a soul. The two of them had been on to collision the whole time, traveling toward each other down 50 years of track, and the only one who could see it was an audience that did not exist. And the only thing left to do was let the harmonica come out into the light. Solomon crossed the floor without hurrying. He did not look at the brokers. He went to Elijah, who was still standing there with the words stuck and his eyes shining and refusing to fall, and Solomon put one wet hand flat between the boy's shoulder blades, the way you steady something that is shaking, and he leaned in and said, "Lo, just for him, the only instruction that had ever mattered. Don't push it. Hum it first. Ride it out." And Elijah, with the whole table watching and the laugh still hanging in the air, closed his eyes and hummed the front of the word the way they did it in the back at 4 o'clock, hummed it like a harmonica, and let the B float out on the breath he already had moving, and said, slow and steady and clear, the entire list of specials, every word, barramundi and soft shell and the bread pudding, all the way to the end, while the loud broker's face did something complicated. And Miss Beverly stopped halfway across the floor, and a man in a gray suit at table 11 put down his spoon and forgot how to breathe. It was later, after the brokers had gone quiet, and Theo had found something urgent to do in the kitchen, that the man from table 11 did a thing he had not done in 50 years. He did not go to Solomon. He was not ready for that, would not be ready for hours. He went, instead, to the counter, where Miss Beverly was wrapping silver in napkins with her back still up. And he sat down on a stool like an ordinary tired man, and because she did not know who he was, she treated him like one, and slid him a coffee he hadn't asked for. And that small unearned kindness was what cracked him. "That old man in the back," Damon said. His voice came out rough. "Has he always done that, with the boy?" Beverly didn't look up from the silver. "Solomon, he don't bother nobody. Keeps to hisself." She folded a napkin. "Why? My brother talked like that." Damon turned the coffee cup a 1/4 inch on its saucer and did not drink it. He had not meant to say it. He had not said it out loud in his entire adult life, not to his wife, not at the funeral, not once. My whole life. My little brother. He couldn't get a word out without the whole room turning to watch, and the sentence stuck. Damon Whitfield, who had never stuttered a day in his life, found there were words that locked behind the teeth for other reasons. "I was at a corner once. Some boys had him against a fence, and I stood there with the groceries, and I watched, because I was ashamed of him. 9 years old and ashamed of my own blood." He set the cabown. "He died in April, and a woman told me he learned to talk in a church basement, from some man with a harmonica. 50 years ago." He laughed, one dry note with nothing in it. "I came here to buy this building. I sat in that chair 3 Fridays to watch how the staff treats the people who can't do anything for them. And I just watched a man set down his towel and cross a whole room to do for a stranger's kid the one thing I never did for my brother." Miss Beverly stopped wrapping silver. She looked at the man in the gray suit, really looked the way you look when you start to feel the size of something. She did not tell him it would be all right. She did not tell him he'd been just a child himself, though that was true. She did not reach for his hand. She just stood there on the other side of the counter, in the late hour of a Friday, and let him have his silence. Miss Solomon stood, the way Solomon's grandmother had taught a whole forgotten clinic of children to stand. "What," Damon said finally, "is the old man's name?" Beverly looked toward the back, where through the pass you could just see a dishwasher, in a wet apron, picking his towel up off the steel and folding it over his shoulder, getting back to the racks, getting back to the only country he'd let himself keep. "Solomon," she said, "Solomon Reed." and the man in the gray suit said the name back to himself once, quietly, the way you test a key in a lock, not yet knowing it would turn. Damon Whitfield did not sleep that Friday, and he did not go to Solomon. And by Sunday, he had half-talked himself out of the whole thing, the way a man talks himself out of a fever, telling himself it was a coincidence that half the old men in this city had a harmonica and a hard luck story, that he had a deal to close and no business chasing ghosts through a kitchen he was about to own. But on Tuesday at 3:45, he found himself parked across from Maribel's again. And he told Theo he wanted to walk the back of the house before the inspection, which was true enough. And Theo, who would have let the buyer walk through his own mother's bedroom, said, "Of course, Mr. Whitfield, take your time. The dead hour at a restaurant is a different country than the dinner rush." The line was wiped down, the floors were drying, Carlos was asleep in his car, and from somewhere past the pass came the low sound of a harmonica, playing 4 slow bars of a hymn Damon had not heard since he was a boy in a pew his mother dragged him to. He stopped in the doorway of the dish room. He did not announce himself. He stood there in his suit that did not look expensive, a man worth $300 million, and watched an old dishwasher and a teenage busboy do a thing in the steam that no one was meant to see. Solomon had the harmonica cupped in both hands. "That's, you don't push it," he was saying. "You hum the front of it first. Then you let the word ride out on the breath you already got moving, like the harp does. The harp don't bite down." He played a long bending note, soft at the front, and Elijah hummed under it and then said a whole sentence clean. And Solomon nodded once, the way you nod at something true, and tapped the 2 filed-down words on the cover plate. "Write it," he said. "That's the whole of it. You write it out." The room went sideways under Damon. 50 years fell on him at once. He heard his brother's voice at a repast in Baton Rouge, second-hand through a choir woman. A man with a harmonica, a church basement, write it out. He heard their father at the dinner table. He heard the boys at the fence and the sound of his own 9-year-old silence. He must have made a noise, because the boy looked up first, and Solomon turned, harmonica still in his hand, and saw the buyer standing in the doorway of the only room he had let himself keep. "Help you?" Solomon said. His voice, when he used it, was lower than people expected, worn smooth. Damon's mouth was dry. "That phrase," he said. "Write it out." "The harmonica. Where did you?" The word locked. Whitfield, who had never stuttered a day in his life, stood there unable to finish, and Elijah, 18 years old, watched a rich man block on a sentence and felt, for the first time in his life, that he was not the one in the room who needed help. "Where did you learn to teach it like that?" Damon got out. "The church basement." "Did you ever run a clinic?" 50 years ago, somewhere near the Calliope." Solomon went still. He stood perfectly still for a long time, the harmonica cooling in his open hands, looking at this stranger who had walked back into the one place he kept locked and named the thing he had buried under 19 years of dishwater and a flood. When he answered, it was barely above the hum of the machine. "I ran one for 11 years, he said, "out of the basement of Greater Mount Zion, 2 nights a week, free, before the water took the church and everything in it. Taught children mostly. Some grown men. Anybody the world had decided couldn't talk." He set the harmonica down on the steel, gently, like a thing that could bruise. "Why? What was your wife's name?" Damon said. He didn't know why he asked it. "Rennie. And the children you taught. Do you remember them?" "I remember all of them," Solomon said. "I lost the building. I lost Renee. I figured I lost them too, that whatever I'd done down there washed out with the rest of it in '05. A man can't keep teaching the world to talk after the world's done that to him." His jaw worked. "Why are you asking me this?" Damon reached into his jacket. He took out a phone and turned it around, and on the screen was a photograph from a funeral program, a heavy-set black man in his 50s, in a deacon's robe, kind-eyed, mid-law, and under it the dates and the name. Isaiah Whitfield, 1973 to 2024. He was 11 the year he learned to talk, Damon said. He told a woman in his church near the end, that he'd have stayed locked inside himself his whole life if a man hadn't taught him to ride his words out on his breath. In a church basement. When he was a boy. Damon's hand was shaking, and a man with $300 million is not used to his hands shaking. He was my little brother. I stood by once while some boys made him cry against a fence, because I was ashamed of him, and I spent the next 50 years making sure I'd never be the soft one. He died in April. I came here to buy this building and gut it. And I think you're the man who gave my brother the only good thing anybody outside our blood ever gave him, and I didn't even ask his name. Elijah, standing off to the side with a bus tub forgotten in his hands, said the thing plainly, the way the young say the things the old can't. So somebody did it for you, he said to Solomon, before you ever did it for me. And Solomon Reed picked up the funeral program off the buyer's phone and looked at the face of a grown man he had last seen as an 11-year-old who could finally order his own po' boy. And the seam in his chest that had torn open Friday tore the rest of the way. He had told himself for 19 years that the flood took everything, that the work was a sandcastle, and the water came, and there was nothing left to show he had ever knelt in that basement night after night, that his life's one real thing had drowned with Renee and the pews. And here was the proof, in a dead man's robe, smiling out of a phone in a rich stranger's shaking hand, that one of his children had carried the work 2 hours up the road and lived a whole life of love on the strength of it. The building was gone. The work had never been in the building. Solomon sat down hard on an overturned milk crate, the program still in his hands, and he wept. He had not wept since the week of the funerals in 2005, when there were too many to attend and he had stopped trying. He had been a dry man for 19 years on purpose. Now it came up out of him in great silent heaves, the grief and the relief tangled past separating, an old man crying over a boy he saved, and a wife he lost, and a basement under 6 feet of black water, and a life that had mattered after all. And Damon Whitfield, watching, came apart at last along the fault line he had been hiding since he was 9. He had built an empire on a single sentence. The world eats the soft ones. He had believed it the way other men believe in God, had organized 50 years and $300 million around it. But the soft one had won. Isaiah, who could barely speak, had been loved by an entire congregation and married a good woman, and raised 2 daughters who wept real tears at his grave, and the hard brother had stood at the back of that funeral with no one's hand to hold. The lesson had been wrong. The lesson had been wrong for 50 years, and he had taught it to himself every single day. Damon's legs gave, and he sat down on the wet floor of a dish room in his good suit, his back against the steel, and the man who had decided at the age of 9 never to be sfed again cried, like the child at the fence, the one who had sets down the groceries and walked over too late, and never, in half a century, walked over in time. He cried for the brother he was ashamed of, and the brother he had no right to grieve, and the 50 years he could not get back. There was no version of the math where it came out even. He knew that. He cried anyway. Elijah set the bus tub down and got 2 glasses of ice water and stood between the 2 grown men on the floor, not knowing what else to do, doing the only thing Solomon had ever taught him that mattered more than the breathing, which was to stay. He did not tell them it was all right. He just stood there, 18 years old, until they could breathe. The deal closed at the end of the month, but not the deal Damon had driven up to make. He did not gut Maribel's. He bought it and left it exactly as it was, kept Theo on a short leash, and gave Miss Beverly a raise she had earned 31 years ago. And he put one line in the contract that his lawyers fought him on, a clause guaranteeing the kitchen staff their jobs for the life of the lease. Then he sat down across from Solomon Reed in the empty dining room on a Sunday afternoon and tried to give him money, because giving money was the only language Damon had ever been fluent in. "I want to make this right," Damon said. "Whatever the number is. You name it." "You can't make it right," Solomon said. "Isaiah's gone. There's no number for that." He folded his hands on the white tablecloth. "And I don't take what I haven't earned. Never have. My grandmother'd come up out of the ground. Then, let me give you something to earn. Damon leaned forward. Greater Mount Zion got rebuilt after the storm. New basement, dry, sits empty 4 nights a week. I'll lease it. I'll cover the rent and the heat and a wage for him to run a free speech clinic out of it. Same as before. Children mostly. Anybody the world's decided can't talk. He swallowed. I'd want to call it after my brother, the Isaiah Whitfield Clinic. But the only man I'd trust to run it spent the last 19 years deciding he was done. Solomon was quiet a long while. Out the front window, a second line was forming up the block for somebody's repast, the brass starting loose and getting tight the way it does. 90 days, he said finally. I'll give it 90 days. If the children come, I stay. If they don't, you've lost some rent and I've lost nothing I haven't lost already. He looked at Damon. And the boy, Elijah. He starts at Delgado in the spring. $2,100 he's been counting toward all year, bussing tables. I won't have him take a dime as a gift. But the clinic'll need an assistant who knows the breathing from the inside. That's a job. He earns it. You pay him a wage to learn to teach it, and he pays his own tuition like a man, and nobody owes anybody anything but the work. Damon put out his hand across the white tablecloth. That's a deal I know how to keep, he said. The months between that handshake and the first Tuesday in February were the busiest of Solomon Reed's last 20 years, and the strange thing, the thing he turned over at his kitchen window at night, was how much of the old life came back the moment he let his hands start doing the old work. Damon had the basement of Greater Mount Zion painted and the drops affixed and 12 folding tables delivered, but he made the mistake exactly once of sending a contractor to set the room up the way a hotel ballroom gets set up, in tidy rows facing front, and Solomon walked in, looked at it, and quietly broke the rows into a loose ring of chairs, because you cannot teach a frightened person to speak by seating him in an audience. Damon watched him do it and said nothing and learned something. Elijah's arrangement they put on paper, because Solomon insisted, because a thing on paper is a thing a man can hold up later and say, I earned this. $14 an hour, 10 hours a week, 2 evenings at the clinic and the prep before them. It came to $140 a week before tax, call it $500 a month, and Delgado's tuition for a full-time semester ran a little over $2,100. Elijah did the math the way he did all his math, slow and out loud and certain, and figured that between the clinic wage and what he kept bussing weekends at Maribel's Hoogs, he could carry the spring himself and start the fall with money in the bank. He turned down the scholarship. Damon's foundation offered him the first time, not out of the pride Solomon had, but because he had watched Solomon refuse a fortune across a white tablecloth and decided that was the kind of man he wanted to be. Solomon made him take it the second time. Pride's a good coat, he told the boy, but it's a coat you can't tuition with. A scholarship you qualified for isn't a handout. It's the world finally paying you what it always owed. There's a difference. Learn it. There was a bad week in January when Elijah nearly walked away from all of it. A regular at Maribel's, drunk and ugly, made the busboy say the specials and then said something low and filthy when Elijah blocked, and Theo, true to the only law Theo had ever obeyed, looked the other way. Elijah came into the back and put his face against the cold steel of the trough and said he was done. He was through standing up there to be a clown. He would find some job where nobody had to hear him talk. Solomon dried his hands. He did not give the boy the breathing. He gave him the harder thing. You think I went to the back of a restaurant for 19 years because I couldn't talk, he said. I went back there because I could, and it hurt too much. Hiding's easy. Hiding's the easiest thing in the world. You hide and you call it peace, and one day you wake up and your whole life has been the back of a kitchen. He hung up the towel. You're not built for the back, son. I can tell. Some of us are meant to stand up front, where it's loud. The loud is the price. You don't get the one without the other. Elijah went back out and finished his shift. He did not quit. 3 weeks later he stood up in front of 9 strangers' children and helped Solomon teach them the breathing. His voice shaking the whole time, and he did it anyway. And that was the night Solomon knew the boy would be better at this than he was. Damon paid for all of it and put his name on none of it. The lease, the wage, the tables, the urn, the heat through that first cold February. It came out of a foundation whose paperwork bore his brother's name and not his own. He did the thing rich men almost never do, which is to write the checks and then get out of the way. The one condition he had asked for, the clinic's name, he had asked for in a voice that broke on the second word. And Solomon had granted it before the sentence was finished. The Isaiah Whitfield Speech Clinic opened in the dry new basement of Greater Mount Zion AIM on the first Tuesday in February under the marquee out front that still read "Be Still and Know." Solomon Reed stood up in front of the first 9 children and their mothers and did not stutter, because Solomon had never stuttered, but his voice broke twice anyway, on the second night and on the night a 6-year-old named Khalil rode the word grandmother all the way out on his breath without a single block, and turned around to find his mother crying in a folding chair against the wall. The mothers were the part Solomon had forgotten. He had remembered the children. He remembered all of them. He had told Damon the truth about that. But he had let himself forget the mothers and the grandmothers and the one young father who came on Thursdays straight off a double at the port, still in his safety vest, to sit against the wall and watch his daughter try. They were the ones who had carried the shame the longest, who had spent years being told by teachers and uncles and strangers at the bus stop that the child just needed to slow down, just needed to try harder, just needed a firm hand, as though a firm hand had ever once helped a brain find a different road to a word. Solomon told them the true thing the first night, the thing the whole clinic turned on, and he told it plain. This is not a habit, and it is not nerves, and it is not anything you did, he said, standing in the loose ring of chairs under the framed harmonica. It is how about 1 person in 100 is built, from the start, in the wiring. Your child is not slow. Your child is not afraid. Your child's mouth and your child's brain are running on 2 different clocks, and we are not here to fix what isn't broken. We are here to teach the breath to carry the word across. That's all. That is the whole secret. Anybody who told you different was wrong, and you can let go of carrying it now. A woman named Renee, not his Renee, but the name went through him like a current the first time he read it off the sign-in sheet. Wept when he said it, because her boy was 9, and she had spent 6 years sure it was her fault, sure she had done something in the carrying of him, or the raising of him, and a man under a harmonica had just set the whole weight of it down off her, back in 4 sentences. That, Solomon came to understand, was half the work. The breathing was a real skill, and it changed children's lives. But the other half, the half he had not expected to be doing again at 62, was simply telling a roomful of tired people that they had not failed, that they were not alone, that there was nothing to be ashamed of in the back of that basement, where the only thing anybody owed anybody was patience. Miss Beverly came on the 3rd Tuesday and stayed. She had heard about it at Maribel's, where the back of the house and the front of the house had quietly become one house since the buyout, and she showed up with a coffee cake she had baked at her own stove, and she made herself she had no intention of taking off. And she made herself the unofficial mother of the mothers, pouring coffee and minding the littlest siblings so the parents could watch. On slow nights she would tell the room a thing or two about 31 years of carrying plates for people who never learned her name, and how a name is the first thing the world owes you and the last thing it bothers to pay. She and Solomon did not court, exactly. They were too old and too marked for courting, but she started walking home the same direction he did. And some Mondays there were red beans for 2 at the window on Josephine Street. And the house got a little less like the back half of a life and a little more like a porch with somebody else on it. The second line came in the spring, for the clinic's first open house, which Solomon refused to call a recital, refused anything that put children on a stage to perform for applause. It was just an evening when each child stood in the ring of chairs and said one thing, one sentence they chose themselves, ridden all the way out on the breath to a room that knew how to wait for it. Khalil said his grandmother's name and the whole length of his address. A teenager named Deshawn, who had not spoken voluntarily in school in 4 years, recited the opening line of a poem he had written and never read aloud. And the young father in the safety vest stood up at the end, uninvited, and said to his daughter across the basement, slow, blocking once and writing it out, that he was proud of her, and that he was sorry it had taken him so long to learn how to wait. The brass that had formed up outside for somebody's repast came loose and tight up the block, and nobody in the basement minded the noise at all. By the end of the first year, the clinic had seen 41 children and 11 grown men and 1 woman of 73 who had not spoken in a meeting in her whole working life, and on the wall above the coffee urn hung a single brass harmonica in a small wooden frame, 60 years old, dulled at the corners, 2 filed-down words you had to tilt to the light to read. Elijah carried a B average his first semester at Delgado and showed up at the clinic 2 nights a week to help with the little ones, and he was good at it. Better than Solomon at the part where you make a frightened child laugh before you make him brave. He bought himself a harmonica of his own with his first clinic paycheck, a cheap one, a $11 Musiostic store on Magazine, and he learned the 4-bar, and one evening Solomon watched him crouch down in front of a boy who had locked up so hard he'd stopped trying, and he heard the boy he had pulled across a restaurant floor say the only sentence that had ever mattered. It ain't your fault, and it ain't wires run. We can work with wires. Solomon stood in the doorway of the basement and did not interrupt. He just stood there till the boy found his words. Then he went home and made red beans because it was Monday and ate them at the window. And for the first time in a very long while, the house did not feel like the back half of a life. Damon came on Thursdays. He sat in the back in a folding chair in a suit that did not look expensive and learned the children's names and held the coffee for the mothers and did not say much because he was learning, at 54, the thing his brother had known at 11, which is that the bravest thing a loud man can do is get quiet enough to hear somebody else come up out of their silence. He never did make it come out even. He knew he never would, but he stopped trying to buy his way back to Isaiah and started spending Thursdays paying it forward to children Isaiah would have loved. And somewhere in the second year, a mother thanked him with tears in her eyes for what his brother's clinic had done for her son. And Damon Whitfield, turnaround artist, did not correct her about who had saved whom. If this story reached you on a long night after a shift nobody noticed, in a kitchen or a hallway, or the back of a room where the work gets done and the names don't get learned, then maybe you already know the person it's about. The one you walk past. The one who never asks for anything. The one who set their whole life down to go stand beside a stranger. Here is the question I'll leave you with, the one that splits the room. Damon spent 50 years ashamed of his brother, and he only walked over to make it right after the man was already in the ground, where no apology could reach him. So tell me, when amends come too late for the person who needed them, who are they really for? Can a debt to the dead be paid to the living? Or is some of it owed forever, and the most an honest man can do is keep paying into a silence that will never answer him back? Send this to someone who would argue with you about it. I want to know what you decide. Because my grandmother used to say a thing, sitting on the porch with the snap beans in her lap, that I have spent my whole life trying to live up to and only half managed. She said it about children who couldn't get a word out, but I have come to believe it is about all of us. Every soul still trying to say the thing it cannot say. You don't rush a man finding his words. You stand there till he finds them. It ain't your fault, and it ain't your nerves. It's just how your wires run. I wrote that line, and then I sat with it a while. I'm not sure I had the right to. I don't stutter. I don't know that fight from the inside. But here's the thing. I keep coming back to who says it second. The old man says it to the kid. Then the kid says it to a smaller kid. The help doesn't stop with the person who got the help. That's the part that stayed with me. If you're hearing this late after a shift nobody clocked, maybe you're the quiet one in the back of some room. The one nobody thinks to ask about. I wrote this one for you. It ain't your fault. It's just how your wires run. Somebody should have told you that a long time ago.